Hey, well, I want to start tonight by answering the question that I think everyone in the room, everyone who's watching online, everyone who's listening to this message next week on podcast, I want to start by answering the question that I think we've all asked at some point during 2020. The answer to that question is yes. 2020 has been a hot mess. I want to go one step further. 2020 has been a hot mess inside a dumpster fire. Let's go one step even further again. 2020 has been a hot mess inside a dumpster fire, inside a train wreck. But here's the good news, y'all. Here's the good news. This is the last Sunday of 2020. There's only a few more days left when we can put 2020 behind us. And in the next few minutes, what I want to do is I want to tell you the one thing that you can do today to make next year slightly better. Now, I say slightly better because I don't want to give you any false hope. I don't want to make a false promise that as soon as the calendar kicks over to January 1, your year is going to magically get better. I mean, we are in church after all, and whether you're a Bible person or not, you know that church is one of the places you probably shouldn't tell a lie. But I do promise that if you do this one thing, not only will next year be slightly better, but I think you might actually be able to look back on 2021 and realize that it was actually a significant year for you. That it wasn't just a hot mess inside a dumpster fire, inside a train wreck. And this one thing, it's also going to help you the next time you're facing a hard situation in life. It's going to help you the next time you're facing a difficult season or when life seems to be just falling apart. But I'm going to get to that one thing in just a minute. Before that, let's be honest. This year has taken its toll on all of us, right? In fact, statistics released in Australia just last month showed that more than 8.5 million Australians reported suffering from mental health conditions in 2020. More than 26% of Australians have struggled with anxiety this year, and depression is up almost 20%. In fact, the report revealed that 1 in 5 people were diagnosed with depression in 2020. Now, I fear that we might miss the significance of that, especially if we're not that 1 in 5. But I want you to take stock of that for a moment because these numbers matter because people count. This number matters because the people around you count. And in fact, let's just process this for a little bit more. 1 in 5 people. Why don't you take a moment right now, just if you're in the room, just to look around the aisle that you're in. If you're watching online, maybe look around the people in the house and just take stock for a minute and ask yourself the question, who are the people around me in my proximity who have struggled or are struggling with depression this year? And then I want you to look up here at me because I am the 1 in 5. 2020 was the year that I got diagnosed with depression. See, 2020 started out looking like it was going to be a great year for me and my family. We had all of these opportunities lined up in front of us. My family and I, we lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and we were surrounded by a community of people who absolutely loved us. My wife and I worked at one of the largest, most successful organizations in our industry. I had speaking opportunities that would take me around the world throughout 2020. I just started work with a company in Israel and had planned several trips to the Holy Land to make YouTube videos. My second book had just sold out on Amazon. My eldest daughter was traveling the world serving communities in need, and my other 2 daughters were seniors in high school. I mean, everything was lined up for 2020 to be an amazing year for us. But then, COVID hit. And by the end of March, Atlanta was in a mandatory 8-week lockdown. This is what a city of almost 6 million people looks like when there's a mandatory lockdown. Here's what it would normally look like on any other given day. But that all changed. Because of COVID, all of my speaking opportunities got canceled. Because of COVID, we had to rush my eldest daughter back to America before the country closed its borders. Because of COVID, my other two kids had to transition from in-person school to online school. And then my work pressure started to increase. As a social media and online pastor, I started getting inundated with calls from churches asking me to help them move from in-person services to online services. I mean, my church alone has more than 100 partner churches around the world, most of whom wanted help shifting their services to online services. So it wasn't long before my hours at work started to increase. And I was getting pushed and pulled and prodded in all different directions at all times of the day and night. And pretty soon, the demand caused by COVID had me working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, for more than 4 months straight. But even though I was working around the clock, I felt like I was struggling to stay on top of the work that I was doing. And I started to lose touch with two of the things in my world that bring me life. COVID lockdowns meant that I could no longer spend time with all of my friends. And as a social sort of person, spending time with my friends is what gives me a lot of life. And that got taken away because of COVID. And while my family was home with me, I wasn't spending time with them because I was always upstairs on my computer doing a Zoom call with a church or doing a podcast or helping out with a staff meeting or something along those lines. So I couldn't spend time with my friends and I couldn't spend time with my family because all of the work demands were so high and because COVID had closed so much down. And it was around that time that I started suffering from insomnia. And I would sleep only about 2 or 3 hours a night for weeks on end. The stress continued to pile up, and so when I would sleep, I would wake up and just feel like I had so much to do, and I would start working around the clock one more time. And after a short period of doing that, my body started to shut down physically and emotionally. Everything just started to hurt. The headaches that I had started to shift to become migraines. And I started to become more irritable. I started to become more frustrated, and I became a lot more short-tempered. Everything that COVID had brought, all the pressure and all the stress, had put me into a downward spiral that I could no longer pull myself out of. And so at the end of July, I finally took my wife's advice and I went to see my doctor, who immediately put me onto antidepressants. I know for a lot of you in the room, your 2020 might have looked bad, but maybe it didn't include depression. I'm sure that despite the fact that you might not have gone to the length that I did, I bet during 2020, all of us at some point experienced these sort of emotions this year. Maybe you felt isolated. Maybe you felt lonely at some point during 2020. Maybe you felt trapped. Maybe you felt scared. Maybe at some point during 2020, you felt anxious. Maybe you felt a higher level of stress in the past 12 months than you've ever felt before. Maybe you've been scared about your own health or the health of a family member. Maybe you're a business owner and you've just been anxious about the future of your business. Or maybe you are one of the millions of people this year who lost their jobs. And the thing you're most anxious about is how you're going to pay your bills next month. I think we have all been through a year that has been hard and dry and barren. 2020 has been a year where I think all of us have asked ourselves at some point, what do you do when there is nothing you can do? All of our plans got changed and we couldn't do anything about it. And when that sort of thing happens, when the world goes through a shift like that, it can be easy for us to get frustrated. It can be easy to get resentful. It can be easy to get angry. And it can get really, really easy to get discouraged. I mean, there were times this year when personally, as a pastor even, I wondered where God was in all of this. I'm sure there were times when we all wondered if God even knew what we were going through. Maybe this year, you wondered if God even cared about your situation. Well, the good news is, if you're a Christian listening to this message, the good news is that the Bible addresses these very questions. And if you're not a Christian, the good news is that the Bible addresses these very questions. You see, for some of you, I know it feels like maybe God has gone missing this year and he's not in your situation. Maybe you feel like he's not in your situation right now, but I believe that God is with you and that we should never let the presence of a hard time cause us to doubt the presence of God. And the reason I say that with some confidence is because of one of the most famous stories in the Bible. It's a story that whether you grew up in church or not, you've probably heard this story. In fact, it's not just one of the most famous stories in the Bible, it's one of the most famous stories in all of human history. It's the story of God leading Moses and the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt and into the desert where they wandered for 40 years. Now, maybe you've read this story for yourself in the Bible. Maybe you've been told, had somebody tell you this story when you were growing up, or maybe you have seen the movie about this story. And right now, I know that you might be wondering, what does the story of God leading a group of people through a desert thousands of years ago have to do with 2020? Well, I actually think it has a lot to do with it. But before I get into that, I want to give you a really quick refresher on this story, okay, just to catch you up. It starts with the Israelites being held in slavery in Egypt for about 400 years. And then along comes Moses, who is told by God that he has to lead the people out of slavery to freedom. Now, during the departure from Egypt, which to this day the Jewish people still call the Exodus, God leads his people through the Red Sea. You may remember that part from the movie. God then takes them to the middle of the desert to a place called Mount Sinai and calls Moses to the top of Mount Sinai and he gives him the 10 Commandments. Again, you probably remember that from the movie as well. And then God leads the people through the desert to the promised land. He leads them through a really hard place to get to the place where he needs them to be. But this is where things go horribly wrong. See, the people start to lose faith in the fact that God is with them and God is for them, and they eventually get stranded in the desert for the next 40 years. Can you imagine that? Stranded in the desert for 40 years. That's 10 Olympic seasons. It means that a trip that should have taken them 2 weeks from Egypt to the Promised Land ended up taking them 40 years. A lot of the ladies in the room right now are going, I understand that because a man was leading them and was too scared to ask for directions. Am I right? Can you imagine what that must have been like? I mean, the Israelites were stranded in the middle of the desert for more than 40 years. I struggled to be stranded in the middle of my own home for 40 weeks, and I had Wi-Fi and Netflix and Apple TV and a popcorn machine, and I still struggled. Now, the Bible often refers to the desert as the wilderness. But I think that word gives us an incorrect picture of where the Israelites were actually stranded. Because the first time I heard this story and I heard the word wilderness, I assumed it meant a forest. So I thought the Israelites were stranded amongst the trees. But then I learned that when the Bible talks about the wilderness, it actually means the desert. So I assumed naturally that there would be sand dunes. I mean, I've seen Aladdin. But this is what the desert of Israel actually looks like. In fact, this is the actual wilderness where the people of Israel wandered in. It's called the Negev Desert, and it sits between Egypt and Israel. You can see there aren't any sand dunes. Instead, it is just a hard and rocky environment. The ground is uneven and it's rough and it can easily throw you off balance. Sounds a lot like 2020, right? I've actually had the chance to visit the deserts of Israel and to work there. And I've even spent a night sleeping in the actual desert that the Israelites were stranded in. So I can tell you firsthand just how hard this place is. In fact, one afternoon that I was there, it reached 52 degrees Celsius. Like that was the hottest I have ever been in my life. It is such an uncomfortable place to be. And I remember specifically when I was doing one video shoot in the middle of the desert one time, the producer asked me to go for a walk on my own into the desert. They wanted to get this epic drone shot of just how isolated this place is. And so they took this shot, and I've only just realized I'm wearing the exact same outfit today. So I walked off into the desert about 2 kilometers. About 30 minutes into it, I reached this point where as I looked around, I could not see the crew that I was with. All I could see around me was desert. And I remember in that moment feeling so alone and so isolated. And it started me wondering what must it have been like to be stranded in this place for 40 years. Stranded, isolated, lonely, anxious. So in the middle of this desert, when the people of Israel have been feeling all of the things that I just listed for decades, Moses gathers them all together, and he says something that I think maybe caused the people to think maybe Moses has lost his mind. Maybe this whole desert isolation thing has caused the old man to go crazy. Moses gathers all the people together and he says to them, "For the Lord your God has blessed you in everything you have done. He's watched your every step through this great wilderness." And I can just imagine as Moses says this, I can imagine the people looking around going, "Dude, do you know what's been happening for the past 40 years? Do you understand that we're all stranded in the middle of the desert? Are you even aware of are you reading the room well at all? How have we been blessed, Moses? Please tell us, how have we been blessed over the past 40 years? And so Moses reminds them, he says this, he says, "During these 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you, and you have lacked nothing." Now notice that Moses doesn't downplay what they've been through. He doesn't tell them to simply stop stressing, stop worrying. He doesn't post on his Instagram, "Don't stress, God's got this." He doesn't do that. He doesn't even reassure them that God is miraculously going to make everything better tomorrow. He simply reminds them that through the toughest, most isolated, most difficult season that they've ever been through, that God has been with them. And I believe that that's true for us today too. No matter what desert you've been through in 2020, no matter what stress, anxiety you're dealing with even right now, God has walked and is walking through that desert with you. God never promised that we wouldn't face deserts. He promised to walk with us through them. All he promised was, when you walk through the desert, I am going to walk through that desert with you. Now, I realize that this might be hard for you to hear, especially if you're a Christian here today. Something like that can be hard for Christians to hear. And so, for just a moment, I would love to just speak to the Christians in the room. So if you're here tonight because somebody promised you some dinner if you came along to church, or if you're watching online because your mum sent you a link and watching the church service is part of your Christmas present to her, I want to give you permission right now. You can tune out, okay? I just want to talk to just the Christians, okay? So just the Christians, just listen up for a moment. I don't know how or why you started following Jesus. But if somebody has told you, or if somebody told you that if you ask Jesus to come into your heart, then everything's going to be rainbows and unicorns, that's not right. It's not even biblical. Again, God never promised that we wouldn't face deserts. He just promised that he would walk through the deserts with us. And Jesus told his followers exactly the same thing. A few centuries after the Moses story, Jesus comes along and says to his disciples, when they're in the middle of a whole different set of tough circumstances, he says to them, "In this world, you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world." Now again, notice that Jesus takes a leaf out of Moses' books. He doesn't tell them that because they're followers of Jesus, they're suddenly untouchable. He didn't say that. He didn't say that they wouldn't face difficult times. He actually says the opposite. He says you will face hard times. Life will get out of control. You will go through times when life is gonna hurt, when you get stressed, when you wonder how you're even gonna get through the situation you're facing. You are gonna face times when you stay up late at night worrying about your family, worrying about your health, worrying about your finances. There are gonna come times when you're scared to wake up to what the next day holds. God promises that will happen, but he also promises to be with us during those hard times. And more than that, God actually promises us that he will equip us with whatever we need to get through any situation. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Late last year, I got to go to Israel with a group from my church. And during that trip, we went to a place that's called En-Gedi. It's a natural spring in the middle of the desert. I mean, this place is stunning. It's surrounded by desert, but all along this valley floor are waterfalls like this. I mean, this place is absolutely gorgeous. In fact, this is a place that one of the most famous kings of the Bible, King David, went to this place. And he wrote a whole bunch of poems while he was there. Those poems are called Psalms, and we actually have a book in the Bible that features all dedicated to all of those poems. But while the team that I was with was all interested in hanging around the waterfalls, there was a point where I know my wife was like, "Where's David during all of this?" And I was off scurrying up these desert trails up the cliff face a little bit because I was so interested in these wild desert goats that were climbing up and down the cliffside on either side of the valley. This is just one of the photos that I took while I was there. I mean, these goats were absolutely everywhere. In fact, the Hebrew word for En-Gedi, that En-Gedi is a Hebrew word that means the spring of the goats. These goats are called Ibex, and they are known for their unique ability to climb up a sheer cliff face. And the Ibex are not only able to survive in this environment, they're actually able to thrive in it because they have this ability to walk on the narrowest of pathways up the most steep incline of a cliff. And the reason they're able to do that is because they have these specially designed hooves. Their hooves are really sharp on the outside, and there's a concave in the middle of the hoof, which acts like a natural suction cup. And it literally helps stick them to the side of a cliff. I mean, if you want to know how amazing their climbing abilities are, this is a video of a dam wall in Italy. And the local Ibex there have learned to climb the wall so they can lick salt from the dam wall. I mean, this thing is nearly 90 degrees, yet you can see how easily the Ibex are climbing up. And they do that simply because of the amazing feat that they've been given. I mean, if you don't believe me how steep this is, have a look at that shot. That is what an Ibex is able to do because God has equipped them with these special feet that allow them to do something unique. Now, while this is interesting, some of you may be wondering, what does this have to do with God giving us everything we need to get through the situations in life that we're going to face? Well, have you ever noticed that sometimes life is an uphill battle? Sometimes you'll face a situation or you'll face a season where it seems like there's an impossible mountain in front of you that you have to try to get over. And usually whenever Christians face uphill battles in life, we start praying that God will take the mountain away. And then we go to church and we ask our Christian friends to pray with us that God will take the mountain away and make the mountain actually a level road that's really easy, no steep incline, maybe no incline at all. God, just take it all away from us. Replace it instead with this easy-to-walk path. But David, the king I spoke about earlier, when he spent time in the desert and when he spent time at En-Gedi and he saw the Ibex going up and down the wall, he wrote this. He said, God makes me as sure-footed as a deer, enabling me to stand on mountain heights. Now, the Hebrew word for deer in that verse is the Hebrew word for Ibex. So perhaps, instead of asking God to take away the mountains that we face in life, instead of asking God to take away any mountains in 2021, perhaps we should be instead asking God to equip us with the feet of an Ibex so that we can climb the mountain. Because sometimes the mountains that we face in life are not there so that we can stop making forward progress. The mountains aren't put there so that we can just stop what we're doing. The mountains are there because, have you ever noticed that when you're at the top of a mountain, you get a whole new perspective? Sure, your mountain might be hard to climb. You might be thinking right now of the mountain, the uphill battle that you're facing, and it might seem insurmountable. But as well-known pastor and author Louis Giglio says, you don't have to know everything about the mountain in front of you to take the next step. So at the start of this message, I said I was going to tell you this one thing that I want you to do today, that you can do, that will make next year slightly better. And while the Ibex thing was pretty interesting, well, at least to me, that was not the one thing That wasn't the thing. But before I actually get to the thing that's going to make next year slightly better, I wanted to make sure that I'd taken enough time to let you know that facing a hard time is normal. Being worried about a hard time is normal. Being scared when you're in the middle of a hard time is normal. Asking where God is when you're in a hard time, that's normal. And having doubts about your faith when you're facing a hard time, that's normal as well. All of these feelings are valid. And I would never stand up here and just tell you to stop worrying, to stop stressing. And I would never expect that a single message in church could stop anyone from being anxious about what the future might hold. But there is one thing you can do to change your perspective during a hard time. I really believe that. And I believe that this one thing will not only make next year slightly better, it'll also equip you for the next time you're facing a hard season in life. And I learned this thing that time that I was walking out into the desert on my own. You see, as I walked out into the desert that day, I reached a certain point where I started mentally doing that calculation of how long they might need to get the shot that they were looking for. And then I started to do the mental math around how long it was going to take me to actually walk back to the car. And so I was processing how long is that going to take, and then I've got to walk back, and I'm going to be in this place for a long time. And I became really focused on when I was going to get out of the desert. And don't we all do that when we're in the middle of a desert? When life is hard, when life is difficult, don't we just want it to be over? Don't we start focusing on when we'll get out of it? I mean, aren't we all collectively counting down the days of 2020? But whenever we're focused on the when we will get out of the desert, when we'll get out of the situation we're in, when the stress will be over, when it will stop hurting, when that relationship will be restored, when I will start work again, when life will get easier. Have you ever noticed that when you focus on the time, everything seems to take forever? So as I stood in the desert on that day, I stopped asking when I would get out of the desert and started asking what I would get out of the desert. And that is the one thing that will make next year slightly better. No matter what you're facing today, no matter what you will face next week, next month, next year, things will only get better by choice. They don't get better by chance. And the choice that you have to make is to stop asking God, when can I get out of this desert? And instead start asking God, what can I get out of this desert? By asking what, you actually give yourself the chance to evaluate how a tough situation has influenced your life. By asking what, you're able to find some purpose in your situation. You might be able to start to find out why you face that uphill battle. And in that purpose, that's where I believe you'll find hope. When my eldest daughter, Chelsea, was born, our new family faced an uphill battle. See, Chelsea was born with a tumor on her spine that was as big as her head. The day after she was born, we were bumped around from hospital to hospital as doctors tried to figure out what they were going to do, and we eventually ended up at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. When she was a week old, Chelsea had a 6-hour operation to remove a tumor from her spine that they told us would probably impact her ability to walk. And I remember as I handed my baby daughter over to the nurse that day, and I signed forms that absolved the hospital of any responsibility if she died during surgery, I remember stepping out of that pre-op area into a desert. And my desert didn't look like the desert of Israel. My desert in that moment looked like a long hospital hallway. Now, when I was in the middle of that, believe me, I just wanted it to be over. I was asking the when question. When is she going to be able to walk? When are we going to have some news? So I was stuck in that place for a while, but as the years went on and as Chelsea came through the surgery without complications and as she started walking normally, my attention started to shift towards the what I could take out of that desert. And as the years continued and she grew, the list of what I took out of it grew longer and longer. And don't get me wrong, I don't know if any of those whats justify what we went through. But I realized that there are a lot of whats. I took a lot from that situation. In fact, just last month, we had some friends in Israel who had some complications during the birth of their first child. And my wife and I were uniquely positioned to support and encourage them because of the desert that we had walked through. And isn't that true? Sometimes pain causes us to be uniquely positioned to help other people who are in pain. And that's one of the whats that you can get out of the desert when you start to shift your focus away. See, if you want next year to be slightly better than this year, then you need to ask yourself, what can I get out of this hard situation? And this really isn't a Christian thing, it's just a thing. But often, the what that you will take away from that situation is a belief that God was with you, an understanding that God was with you in the middle of that desert.